Okay, we're at the bottom of the hour, 10:30. Welcome, everybody. For those of you who are new to this webinar series, welcome. For those that are coming back, welcome back. You're here. This is the governor's budget proposal priorities for 22-23 with Peter Birdsall and Ricky Robertson. And Cynthia next there. My name is Aaron Heintzman. I'm the Corwin Senior Professional Learning Advisor. There's my contact information, aaron.heintzman@corwin.com, and my number. You'll also get a copy of this slide deck along with this recording, so you can actually access any of my contact information. And for those who know me, hello. Zoom keeping reminders. Here's a few items. Open the chat box. Please use the chat box. We're going to have a Q&A at the end for any questions for Peter or Ricky, and I'll be monitoring that. So either just please use that as much as possible for questions. This webinar is being recorded. Like I mentioned earlier, this will be sent along with your certificate of attendance via email just in the next few days. And just in case, info@k k12.corwin.com, just to make sure it doesn't go to your junk folder. What is it? You'll receive it in your inbox. Next slide. Here's a few of our upcoming free webinars. So again, January 24th is our next one with Michelle Trujillo. And then our next webinar for the budget process with Peter Birdsall and Doug Fisher will be on March 17th. Okay, well, please let me introduce Peter Birdsall. He is the Executive Director of the Professional Learning Coalition and former Executive Director of CSESA, the California County Superintendent's Education Services Association. His experience in state education policies includes serving as a legislative advocate for numerous California school districts, county offices, and professional professional associations. Peter?
Thank you very much. Appreciate you having me today. Just real quickly, the Professional Learning Coalition consists primarily of school districts around the state who are committed to the importance of state support for professional learning that is formula-based, so that everybody receives those resources, and that is district directed, so it reflects the specific circumstances and needs of each district and county office and charter school. If you're interested in more information about the coalition, please email me. You'll see it. My email is there on the address is there on the slide. The other importance of having my email address is that the budget, this is the beginning of a 6-month process. The governor's budget proposal is not just the beginning, it's the single most important piece of information, because it sort of sets the parameters and the agenda, but it's not a finished product. The next key date will be February, when the governor releases the what's called the budget trailer bill, and that's when we'll see the precise legislative language to implement a number of the proposals that I'll be describing in the next few slides. But those description of those is based on what's the governor has presented in a narrative form, not legislative language, and also conversations with staff in the governor's administration. So if we start with the next slide, please. So the key takeaway from my perspective from this part of the presentation is that you can all, assuming your district serves elementary grades and pre-K, then you should be planning to move forward with, I think this went one slide too far. Full speed ahead, that's it. There we go. That you should be prepared to move forward with the Universal Transitional Kindergarten and the Expand Learning Opportunities Program. These programs were established in last year's budget. They have broad support both in the legislature and the governor. I see the chat message there. Aaron will be announcing later. The slides will be sent out with the recording to everybody, so you will be getting a copy of the slides. So, the commitments are there, the funding is there, so plan on it. If we can move to the next one. There are some implementation issues. And on universal transitional kindergarten, the first part that's clear, hopefully you're already, assuming you're setting those grade levels, so you're already planning on it. They're expanding the eligibility to the February 2nd birth date. So these are children that become 5. Currently, it's by December 2nd are entitled to go to transitional kindergarten, and the state will fund those. Now they'll add 2 months, so it'll be those adding those with birth dates in December and January. And then following year 13, 14, they'll add another couple months. So this is part of the planned expansion of PK. The funding for it is included in the budget. Everybody's committed to it. So that's clearly a go. I think the next one is a little bit more of a challenge because the language in the budget was approved this year, so it's current law, calls for going from a ratio of 1 to 24 down to 1 to 12 in 2022-23. The good news is the funding is in the budget, so it's not a state issue, it's a local issue given all the staff shortages that districts and counties are experiencing up and down the state. So that's a significant implementation challenge, but the funding is there, so it's not a policy issue. You can move to the next slide, please. Sorry, can you next, please? Next slide. Cynthia, Charlene. There we go. Sorry. So the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program. It appears we're having technical difficulties. Okay, now the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program. It was also approved in this year's budget. The good news is, again, it has broad-based legislative support, governor support, and there's funding in the budget. Increased funding by $3.4 billion a year. I mean, it's just an enormous figure, taking it up to $4.4 billion a year. So this is the program for grades K through 6 to offer a 9-hour day, combining instructional day plus before school, after school, plus intercession and summer school. There are a series of implementation issues. It's the funding formula is unclear, so it makes it a little bit difficult to tell you exactly how much money you're going to get. And the audit requirements are somewhat unclear, so people are concerned about that. Those issues will be part of the budget debate this spring. So you have my email address. Part of this is information heads up. Part of it is advocacy. If you have concerns, then please contact me. And this, as I said, they'll be working on that in budget language on implementation issues. But the implementation is going to go forward. So you should be planning on it. It's a just broad-based commitment to dramatically expand after-school opportunities, enrichment programs for grades K through 6. The governor's budget also includes $937 million in one-time funding to quote unquote integrate arts and music programming into these programs. This is where the February 1st date becomes important. That's when statute requires the governor release the proposed trailer bill. They may miss it by a few days, but in early February, we'll see how that money is going to be allocated, so who gets it, and what exactly you're supposed to do with it. So the message right now clearly is emphasizing the importance of arts and music to engaging students. This is going to be the first time I comment on what's sort of going to be a recurring theme on several of these slides, which is now, this is one-time money. This is the first piece of this budget presentation I've made that describes one-time money. And so this will be part of the legislative discussion. Does the legislature approve this allocation? And if so, how much? Not because anybody is against arts and music, but because legislators have other priorities that they're going to want to use some of that one-time money for. Most significant dollar-wise probably is districts are concerned about their required employer contributions to the pension funds, CalPERS and CalSTRS. And so there's going to be a big demand for one-time money to help offset those costs. And the governor did not include that funding in the budget. So that'll be sort of a mix in this presentation of how you should plan for the year, what you can plan on for the coming year, and some of the advocacy issues either in the hopes that you find it interesting or that you might want to get engaged in those discussions. The other is the governor indicates they will have language to clarify that funds under this program may be used for literacy tutors. So we will alert you as to what that means, but had you asked me, I would have told you could use it for literacy tutors, so I don't think this is a big change. Next slide, please. A new proposal by the governor's office that was telegraphed, leaked, whatever you want to call it, early, is his concern about dyslexia, issues of dyslexia. And the budget includes $2 million for to revise the preschool assessment tools to include items to identify early students, children with learning disabilities, and then $60 million to train educators on the use of those tools. This is a big issue for a lot of legislators and certainly for the governor's office. In the context of the budget, it's not very much money, so I'm confident this will be approved. So if that's useful to you, have that information. Unfortunately, we can't tell you how the money will be allocated yet because we haven't seen the trailer bill language. As I said, that should be available in February. Next, please. So now it starts getting a little bit more speculative. The governor proposes $500 million in grants to HighNeed Schools. We assume those would be ones with large numbers, percentages of unduplicated students, to train and hire literacy tutors. In prior webinars sponsored by Corwin, both John Hattie and Doug Fisher have talked about the significant impact of positive impact of highly trained tutors. So I think this makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, this is one-time money again, and there are going to be other legislative demands and for one-time money. And there's already $3.4 billion going into the increased funding ongoing for the Expand Learning Opportunities Program, plus that $900 million that's been earmarked for arts and music. So this is just part of that, what I'll call pot of money the legislature can be looking at in terms of how they balance the governor's proposals with their own desires for one-time money. So if you have already decided that tutoring is really high quality, tutoring is really important, and certainly from everything I've heard, that is a really good use of those resources. Using the federal funds you have, some of the state funding that's already been approved, you might want to rely on that. And then if some or all of this money is approved in the budget, then it'll be available for several years and you can then sustain those activities. There's also $200 million to create or expand multilingual school or classroom libraries. Just repeat everything I just said. Nobody's against school and classroom libraries. The question is going to be how much money they want to spend on other things and where do they get that money, and then this will settle out. So these are both what I would call in the advocacy category. If you feel strongly about either these are not needed or these are important, then through our coalition, through AXA, through CTA, whatever your affiliations are, that would be a place to make your voice known. Next, please. Career technical education, sort of startling, if I may say so, because last year the governor didn't include anything for CTE in the budget. And a lot of us had to fight to get that funding in the budget. Now this year includes over $2 billion in one-time funding. I think you're picking up a theme in my comments so far. Nobody's against CTE, just the opposite. There's a lot of support for it. Having said that, this is 1.5 billion plus 500 million, so it's $2 billion in one-time funding when there are going to be other demands. So we'll see how much this is actually approved in the budget. I will say sort of odd thing to me about the pathway grants is, according to the State Department of Finance, which works for the governor, this would be a new grant program. So we already have the CT incentive grant program administered by the department. We have the K-12 strong workforce program administered by the community colleges. And now this would be a third program. I think the legislature is going to be somewhat skeptical of that. So there's going to be both a fiscal debate, how much money, and then a policy debate about what's the best way to align these funds. if your district has ag ed incentive programs, $2 million is 100% increase. So that's I think that small amount that will be a very popular program that will go through. But the other two CT programs, I think, fall into the advocacy category, or if you don't advocate, at least I would wait and see how those progress. Move to the next one, please. Independent study. So this could be several slides. I guess the first key point is that distance learning will continue to have to be provided through independent study. So that is, districts have, I think, come to adjust to that change in law this year. The governor is not proposing a change, and we don't anticipate a change in the coming year. So that will be the mechanism to offer and claim funding for independent study programs. What the governor does say is they are going to propose changes to statute, to state law, to allow for synchronous instruction to count for instruction in addition to the work product that currently is used to claim ADA. Again, we haven't seen the language, but how they would combine those two to calculate ADA, but I think conceptually, it makes sense that synchronous instruction would count as instructional time. And then they say they're going to provide flexibility on the timeline to collect a signed agreement. This was a really important short-term change that was approved this year, so that you didn't have to have the signed agreement in advance of the student entering independent study with all of the disruption because of COVID. Obviously, you just can't plan these things in advance, so that was an important flexibility. The administration has not told us what that flexibility, if it's going to be the same flexibility or a different timeline. So that will be in the trailer bill language that gets released in early February. And obviously we'll update you. That will be part of the webinar that we're doing with Corwin and Doug Fisher in March. But through other venues, we'll get the information out before then. Next slide, please. The LCAP, I guess the good news, because the frustration part, I've heard a lot of people talk about pandemic, and so here's a longer plan, more planning, but it would clarify how special ed fits into the local control accountability plan. So the proposal is to develop a special ed addendum to the LCAP. We've talked to the administration. It is not their intent that this would apply to the 22-23 LCAP. The LCAP is due this June. It would apply for the first time to the subsequent, the update that's due in 23-24. So, I think we do need clarity on special ed, is how special ed is incorporating the LCAP. So that's good. And it's good that it's not going to be whatever the resolution is, it's not going to be urgent trying to make these changes this June. So hopefully that, if there's good news, I think there's a lot of good news in this actually, in this presentation. But there's good news, hopefully, that you're not required to come up with a whole new planning addendum by this June. Next slide, please. So then the big dollar amounts in the budget, not entirely true, because as I said, there's $3.4 billion to expand learning opportunity. But the sort of key school finance provisions, the cost of living adjustment, COLA, is 5.33%. The actual specific number will be based on a federal formula that index that we'll know a little bit later this spring, but it'll be somewhere around that, maybe a little bit up given what's been going on with inflation. That will be funded. There's more than enough money to pay for the COLA, so you can expect that to be part of your planning, budgetary, and collective bargaining process this year. Arguably the biggest policy debate, given the focus of this webinar, I didn't start with that, is going to be how the state accommodates declining enrollment. Districts in the state, we have a baseline decline in the number of students. We've had students disappear because of migration and COVID and just losing track of them and all kinds of issues. Obviously, with COVID and quarantines, there have been a lot of absences. So decline enrollment is a huge issue across the state. The governor is proposing to allow a 3-year average, which would both reduce the short-run impact of declining enrollment and provide a little more stability in district planning. So it's not certainly not a bad idea. There are several other ideas already circulating in legislature. This is one of those issues that's very much in the eyes of the beholder. There are some districts that have suffered huge declines in a very short period of time. So they want more relief. There actually are a few districts that have grown in the ADA. So this will be a major discussion in the legislature, and it probably will require money to solve that problem. The cost of the governor's proposal is a little bit over $1 billion. So that'll be part of what goes on in the budget discussion of key policy issues. The other part is just sort of balancing how do you move money among these various choices, and hopefully you pick that up in my discussion on the one-time funding. I think that's going to be one of the key issues addressed by the legislature in terms of what are the priorities they want to address. The governor proposes $1.5 billion for primarily for school buses, but also charging stations, things like that. I think everybody thinks that's a good idea. The question will be the amount of money. And then $596 million to provide universal access to subsidized school meals. This will be 2 meals a day. I think the legislature is going to really like that issue. The concern we've heard is that $596 million is not enough. So that becomes part of this balancing process. And then not on the list, because this reflects the governor's proposal, is the issue of employer contribution to pension plans. This is the increased employer contribution to CalPERS and CalSTRS that the state has paid for the last couple of years. The governor has not proposed to continue paying that. So that becomes an immediate cost on school districts and counties and charter schools all across the state. And so people are going to be arguing to restore that money. And then the question, just like in your local budget, becomes where does this money come from? So that's a quick run through on the entire budget. The pieces that are most are clearest in terms of predicting is universal TK is going to happen, and the dramatic expansion of early education and the expanded learning opportunities program. So with that, I'd like to transition to Ricky Robertson. Ricky has worked with students from pre-K through 12th grade who've persevered in the face of adverse experiences and trauma. Drawing from that experience as a teacher and a behavior intervention specialist, he coaches educators in developing a relation-based approach to teaching and learning. He's a highly regarded author and consultant who, among other things, has worked closely with California's Surgeon General to address adverse issues of adverse childhood experience and trauma. Ricky, I want to welcome you and like to ask you if, as schools prepare to implement this dramatic expansion of after-school programs and early education, what recommendations do you have for how they should address the social emotional needs of their students?
Thank you, Peter. And it's an honor to be with everyone this morning. And I think I want to begin by thinking big picture in terms of looking at the expanded learning opportunities program, the universal access to pre-K within the context of what we saw last year with the governor's budget. The 2021 budget saw historic levels of funding to support the mental and behavioral health of youth in California, and millions of dollars of one-time funding allocated to expand social emotional learning in our schools. And so we're really kind of in the midst of a paradigm shift in terms of how we approach education and holistic care for young people in our state. I think the long-term vision, because this will take years of work as we transition, is really looking at this expanded access to pre-K, expanded access to enrichment and before and after school programming, but also with things like the $4.4 billion invested last year in the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative, We're also going to see expanded trainings on the prevalence and impact of adverse childhood experiences and trauma. And over the next years to come, really building the infrastructure for cross-sector care, where over time we will see hopefully more and more partnerships between schools and behavioral and mental health clinicians, community-based organizations, and local service providers. And for folks that are curious in terms of what that can look like, I highly recommend looking at and exploring the California Surgeon General's Roadmap for Resilience, which is a fantastic policy guiding document that really takes us through everything from the impact of trauma and toxic stress on young people and their development, but also what our best practices in supporting the mental health and social emotional well-being of young people in schools, as well as in healthcare, in criminal justice, in health, et cetera. So again, that's the California Surgeon General's Roadmap for Resilience. For those of you that are curious around what could this vision look like as we start to address childhood trauma as a public health crisis in our state and think about systemic care and cross-sector care to support the social emotional well-being of young people. And so if we could move to the next slide, I'd appreciate that. So I want to just, as a consultant and coach, I work with schools and districts throughout the US and many of them here in California. And one of the things I think that concerns me is that it is a blessing, so to speak, to have the financial resources, the funding made available to our schools. But as Peter pointed out, we're also in the midst of a staffing crisis. Some of our districts are experiencing declining enrollment. And so what can happen, I think, in moments of having a lot of funding, but also having a lot of significant challenges and difficulties is we can start to throw money at problems without having a clear plan for, are we building a foundation for providing a real continuum of care for the young people in our schools, and thinking about long-term implementation and how we can maximize the impact of the work that we do. So I think what I saw last year was a lot of districts that rushed to purchase PD around trauma or social emotional learning, or to purchase an SEL curriculum, but without a lot of thought in terms of how will we build the collective efficacy of our educators to address the social, emotional, and behavioral needs of our students and really provide systemic support. So one of the first things I just want to invite us to be thinking about as administrators is, what does the continuum of care currently look like within your school district, or if you're an education, county office of education within the districts that you serve? And when I talk about a continuum of care, I'm talking about, what do the social, emotional, and behavioral supports provided to students look like from pre-K and kindergarten all the way to 12th grade? In fact, sometimes when I'm working with a district, I will have the schools on chart paper. I'll have the different leadership teams write out, what are your tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 social, emotional, and behavioral supports? And then we'll put those pieces of chart paper up around the room, starting with all of the elementary schools, then the middle schools, and the high schools. And what we commonly discover is a lot of different social emotional supports in elementary school, and then they gradually disappear as we get to middle school and high school. And so when we think about tragic news of school shootings, or we think about the skyrocketing rates of suicidality, anxiety, and depression among middle school and high school age students, and then we look at the fact that oftentimes social emotional learning in a district will end once a student finishes 5th grade. So where is that continuum of support as we get to middle school and high school? And so I'm going to talk about the Expanding Learning Opportunities Program and Universal Pre-K in a moment, but I think before we dive into what are we going to do with that funding, how are we going to implement these programs, we have to first think, what is our plan? What does our continuum of care and social, emotional, and behavioral supports look like from pre-K to 12th grade? And that will include some questions around what that can look like for things like summer school or enrichment programs, et cetera. So really inviting you to think of in terms of systems and not just strategies. This isn't about providing and spending our money on focusing just on equipping educators with strategies, but really thinking about teams and teamwork and how we can provide multi-tiered social, emotional, and behavioral supports for students. And realizing that in order to do that, we have to first care for the adult. We have to also be thinking about the teachers and the educators that we currently have and how we retain them, especially in times of a recruitment and hiring crisis. And thinking about not just equipping them with knowledge to identify symptoms, compassion, fatigue, and burnout, and tools for self-care, also collective or community care. In other words, what can our schools and our districts do to support the resilience, the retention, and the well-being of our educators? So those are some big picture things I wanted to invite you to think about before we start to dive into specifics is, what's the context within which these initiatives are occurring? If we're really looking at a paradigm shift in terms of how we support the mental health and social emotional well-being of our young people, then what is our plan? What does our continuum of supports look like across grade levels? And how can we build systems, teams, and teamwork, evidence of impact, data to make sure that the social emotional learning initiatives, the behavioral supports that we provide are actually having an impact on the young people that we serve, and that we sustain and support the well-being of our educators in that process. Next slide. So when we think about the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, and we think about some of the potential funding that we may receive for things like arts and music programming, which I'm sure there'll be funding, but as Peter pointed out, we don't know the amount yet, et cetera, because of competing priorities. I do want to highlight, as someone whose work primarily focuses on trauma-informed practices and mental health and social, emotional, and behavioral supports, that we certainly know that arts and music are been proven to foster learning, engagement, but also to support the social, emotional well-being of young people. In fact, there's plenty of research to show that arts and crafts activities will naturally help to calm the nervous system within 5 to 15 minutes. So it can be a strategy to help students manage stress and anxiety across grade levels. And we have wonderful programs that folks can look at, like UCLA Arts and Healing, where UCLA Arts and Healing provides professional development on really how do you integrate arts and music programming in ways that maximize student engagement and support student mental health as well. We can also look at the fact that we're going to have funding to expand after and before school programming, enrichment programs, partnerships with community-based organizations and nonprofits. And this is very exciting because it gives us the potential to think about the holistic needs of students. It also invites us to be thinking about how to better support students and their parents and caregivers, and really expanding that wraparound support, that wraparound care, those community-based partnerships. And I want to also invite folks to be thinking, so if we're going to be expanding, for example, summer school programming, before and after school programs, et cetera, how can we do that in ways that are intentional to support the well-being of our students? So even if we're thinking about summer school, I want to invite you to be asking the question, well, what will our social, emotional, essential practices be? In other words, even in summer school, we can address the mental health and social emotional needs of students. But what will those essential practices be? What will our welcoming routines be as we welcome students into school at the start of the day? What ways might we embed regulation activities throughout the day? How might we close the day with some form of an optimistic closure? In what ways can we even think about things like summer school or enrichment programs through that social emotional lens? And the beauty of partnering with community-based organizations is it broadens the access to support for so many of our students, our parents, and our caregivers, which is so needed right now. Next slide, please. Which brings me to talk about something I'm particularly excited about, which is expanding access to pre-K. And I work in a number of different states, including some states that already have universal pre-K or are very close to having universal access to pre-K. And I'm just going to speak frankly. We've had this pandemic the past 2 years. During the past 2 years, we have seen skyrocketing rates of domestic violence, of parent and caregiver suicidality, anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. We've seen increased rates of poverty and homelessness in many communities. And so we've seen a significant increase in a number of adverse childhood experiences and forms of trauma. And we've also experienced, I think the pandemic itself has been for many, perhaps a form of collective trauma, but certainly a very dysregulating experience for children as well as adults. And so educators have to understand that especially when children are at the age of preschool, they're going to communicate those experiences and that exposure to chronic and toxic stress through their behavior. And so how do we equip our educators with professional development that helps them to understand the prevalence and impact of adverse childhood experiences and trauma, that equips them with strategies and tools to address and view student behavior as a form of communication and address students' needs for safety, belonging, and feeling valued? Where they think about how to structure a pre-K environment that is both connected and firm, with clear, consistent routines and expectations, with a focus on building positive relationships, and making sure to embed different regulation strategies throughout the day to help students emotionally and physically regulate. The sad reality is that many states I work in that currently have universal pre-K, preschool teachers are overwhelmed by the social, emotional, and behavioral challenges that they are seeing among young children right now. Levels of physical aggression, the vocabulary, the language they're using, all signs and symptoms of dysregulation, of exposure to chronic and toxic stress. And so in order to help our educators to avoid burnout and to help them to be effective, we have to be front-loading them with professional development and really thinking in that continuum of care. What does our social, emotional, behavioral supports, what will they look like in preschool? And then as they transition into kindergarten and elementary, and then middle school and high school. And so building the capacity of our educators, once again, to work together as teams, to be thinking about multi-tiered levels of support, that there are going to be children that will need social, emotional, and behavioral small groups, that might need tier 3 interventions, behavior plans, counseling, wraparound supports. And we have to proactively plan for the social, emotional, and behavioral needs of our students, not just be in a position of reacting and responding to. And so I think that I don't want to sound negative, but as I was preparing for today and I was preparing for the conversation with Peter, I was thinking about, okay, what I know is that we have many educators that are overwhelmed by what they're seeing in their classrooms and their schools. And we're trying to just put a Band-Aid on the bullet hole, so to speak, and throw strategies at it, or buy an SEL curriculum, and we'll teach that for 20 minutes a day. And we're trying to check the boxes, but we're not actually looking at what truly works to support students' social, emotional well-being and support their resilience. We're not looking at what it takes to actually develop long-term plans for systemic transformation and really building those teams and teamwork and looking at that evidence of impact to make sure what we're investing in is working. Because, for example, it can be far more impactful to embed opportunities throughout the school day for students to practice different social emotional skills than simply delivering a lesson from Second Step or an SEL curriculum for 20 minutes a day. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those curriculums. I'm asking, how do we take something from a curriculum and integrate it into content instruction and learning? Because that's where we see the greatest impact. So if we're going to have universal access to pre-K, then let it be a preschool environment where students are able to learn, where students are able to self and co-regulate, where students are able to develop social, emotional, and behavioral skills that will help them as learners and to get their needs met in healthy ways, and will decrease some of the challenges that many of our educators are currently seeing and experiencing. I want to play a video from Head Start Trauma Smart in Missouri that highlights a lot of what I just spoke about. You're going to see in this video examples of educators receiving professional development in strategies to support students' social, emotional, behavioral needs, supporting the educators to self-regulate so that students can then co-regulate. And you'll also see some of those things that will be available to us through the Expanded Learning Opportunities program, which is access to supports for parents and caregivers and community organizations in partnership with mental health clinicians, behavioral health specialists, et cetera. So I think it's a good way to see in action some of the things I've just spoken about. So if we could please play that video.
It was about 2 years ago when my grandson, Jeremiah, at the age of 2, witnessed his father shoot and kill his mother in her car, and then it was a murder-suicide.
But does the mommy go on the bus? No.
And him and his brothers were strapped in their car seats in the back seat.
We're going to the hospital.
There's no words to put in place of how that feels.
At Head Start Trauma Smart, our goal is really to help young children, their caregivers, their family members, the teachers who work with them, really understand how trauma affects early childhood development and then what to do about that.
Across the general population, 1 in 4 children will experience a significantly traumatic incident before they're 4. The number that really gets your attention is that 50% of those children will experience that 3 or 4 times. We've started with Head Start programs because that commitment to early childhood intervention is very, very strong. The children are really seeing a lot more than they can explain. And what happens is that they become hypervigilant, they are tired, they startle easily, their hearts beat rapidly, and they can't focus. So sit down, come to the table, and learn with us, even if I want to. Probably isn't possible.
You want your mommy? Well, I know you want mommy, but you know what? You're here with me and you're in a safe place.
We went through the Head Start Trauma Smart program for, I believe it was a whole year of training.
You want to sit by Raymond? Did you ask Raymond if it's okay if you sit by him?
They showed us how to use the tools and implement it into the classroom. It has helped me tremendously. When a child is upset, the first thing I do is I notice that they're having big feelings. Then I'll speak with the child and I'll name, hey, Joseph, you're having a big feeling right now. And then I'll validate. It's okay to have that big feeling, but what can I do to help you? Want to breathe in and breathe out. For Jeremiah, we have had an ongoing concern with him being able to express how he feels.
Yeah.
Being able to ask for what he wants. When the murders first occurred, it was a lot of just standing there pointing or waiting, and you had to ask, Jeremiah, are you hungry? And Head Start Trauma Smart actually got us on a path where Jeremiah is able to now say how he feels.
We are absolutely very focused on the children, but to be focused on a child, you have to understand they come in context. So they come in context with a family.
We just want to equip you as parents with as many tools as possible to support your child.
They come in context with their school.
Your emotional state becomes the emotional state of your classroom.
And so you must include their family and the people in their school. So that might be the bus driver that greets them every morning. Whoever it is who's touching that child has to also know how to manage their emotion and their day-to-day living.
We are the first people that the children will see in the morning. I really applied what Trauma Smart taught me.
Within Head Start Trauma Smart, there is a very healthy dose of that whole self-care piece because the adults in the environment, the parents and the staff, were struggling themselves with secondary trauma.
So what face is this?
Sad sad face. Could I see your sad faces? Let me see your sad faces. Oh, those are so sad. Let me see your mad faces.
And you have to have enough within yourself to be able to respond appropriately with the child.
Head Start Trauma Smart is currently in a growth phase. We are expanding this program across the state of Missouri. We know that we can't stop bad things from happening, but we can really make a difference so that people can survive those bad things and then know how to thrive after they've happened.
I need for Joseph to lead us in head, shoulders, knees, and toes.
Now that I have those techniques from Head Start Trauma Smart, I can breathe, I can teach, I can deal with the social emotional issues on one hand, and I can teach on the other, and still have a classroom environment that's a community, that's learning, that's caring and safe for our kids.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And that's just one example of really thinking about how to engage in preschool and in a way that truly addresses the holistic needs of our students. Because if we don't address their social, emotional, and behavioral needs, then no learning will take place. And that's true across grade levels, from pre-K all the way till 12th grade. So really thinking big picture about our plan for what does a continuum of social, emotional, and behavioral supports look like across grade levels. So thank you and for this opportunity to connect some aspects of the governor's budget to how we look at supporting students' social, emotional, and behavioral needs in ways that are trauma-informed.
Thank you, Ricky. We're at our Q&A time right now, and one of the questions that we have, and I think this would be for Peter, question is, with Universal TK, is the funding also available for non-classroom based public charter schools? There seems to be confusion on this front.
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat. Was somewhat surprised by it because I would have said the answer is yes. I mean, the legislature and the governor's view is that TK is now a central part of the regular school sequencing, TK through grade 12. I was able to glance at the TK universal TK statute. I didn't see anything that prohibited non-classroom based charters, so I will check on it. But with a reasonably high degree of confidence, I'll say no, they are not prohibited. That's part of the student population they're supposed to serve. The variation on that is the legislature has imposed a cap on an ADA cap, a growth cap on non-classroom based charters. And so to the extent the state expands TK, if you're not allowed to claim funding for that ADA, then it's sort of a false promise. And that certainly will be an issue in the legislature this year, both for charter schools and for regular schools. So I will check, but my understanding, absent that cap on growth, is that non-classroom based charters do also participate in the TK program, Universal TK.
Thanks, Peter. I think another one for you. Does this mean that all basic aid community funded districts will also receive funding to run TK?
No, they won't like the answer because TK is, like I said, it's becoming part of the ADA system. The governor's budget does, quote unquote, re-bench Prop 98 it increases Proposition 98 to reflect the additional average daily attendance that come out of expanding TK. That's part of the general ADA system, and community-based basic aid districts. If you have enough property taxes to pay for that base program, then you don't get state aid, additional state aid. So circuitous way of saying no, unless you're like right on the cusp of going out of basic aid into state funding, they will not get state funding for TK programs.
Thank you. Well, we covered a lot here in the last 45 minutes. If there's anything that has to do with any sort of the budget questions, I think Peter would be a good resource. I mean, you have his email. For also Ricky, you have his email, and then my email as well, to kind of cover kind of everything about what we talked about today in our entire series around the budget numbers here. Next slide, Cynthia. Yeah, we're coming to the end.
Aaron, I saw the chat, the follow-up on ADA for basic aid. Aaron, okay for me to interrupt for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to say that basic aid districts get ADA, but that is part of the calculation. They look at the ADA to see how much funding they're supposed to get, and then does the property tax pay that entire bill? So if adding TK ADA doesn't reach that property tax level, then they still are entirely community funded. So, you know, the two, technically, you know, they're not funded based on ADA, they're funded on property taxes, but that is part of the calculation that goes into determining whether you're community funded or not. Hope that makes sense. Basic aid districts will understand that answer.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Ricky, for everything. For folks that want to see more of Ricky, there's some upcoming institutes. One's coming up very quickly on March 2nd. Our institutes are a great way, especially for smaller groups or school sites, to really connect with Ricky's work. And then it follows up with another April 7th and 8th institute with a lot of folks from Corwin. Next slide, please. And then lastly, for anything within California, I get a chance to see throughout California what the impact of this funding is doing for districts and school sites. So please reach out to me as a resource. If there's anything that I can help with, I'd be happy to have that conversation with you. And then lastly, our last slide, as a thank you, this is probably the biggest discount code that I've seen, but save 30% in free shipping using that webinars 22 promo code. If you have some of the titles, Corwin titles that you would like to purchase for your staff, for yourself, please use that. And to wrap it up, thank you, Peter and Ricky, for joining us today. We hope everybody enjoyed the webinar, and we hope that you see us in the next session on March 17th with Peter and Doug Fisher to continue the conversation here about legislation and budget planning for 22-23. So thank you, everybody. I hope everybody has a safe, it's been obviously an interesting start here for 2022, but